I'm glad to be here to be talking about how we can facilitate open science in practice. And I think the lessons that we learned in a survey and a series of interviews nicely complement the things that you found in your user study from the university library. So I think, first of all, it's important to start with the official rules. So in the Netherlands, we have this code of conduct for research integrity, where there is a clear guideline. Data collected should be described honestly, scrupulously, and as transparently as possible, and to contribute where appropriate towards making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable in accordance with the FAIR principles. But is this a reality? That's a prescription. I think if we provocatively visualize what we did previously, we published things where we said, okay, this is what I found. And like some kind of magic, the results appear out of nowhere because most publications don't share the data that they used to report something. And we are going into a direction of less magic and more cuisine, but not very stringently showing what we did exactly, as if the cook can reproduce their recipe that was prize winning in the end. Well, like the Swedish chef of Sesame Street, he may be knowing what he's doing, but it's very hard to follow what he did exactly. We are trying to change this research culture. This today here may be an audience of innovators or early adopters, people who are very much in favor of open science and want to be transparent and open as possible. But the question is, how do we get the 75% on board that is remaining? First, after talking about the rules, maybe we should talk about what data we are talking about. We think about data in three forms. So you can talk about raw data. Suppose you have hospital cases of COVID-19. There is some registration in the hospital. It will be processed in a database, and then in the end, there might be some analyzed data in the form of tables and graphs that show what the results are of these analyses. That's a standard way of many people thinking about data. But the reality can be very different. Suppose you record messages from interviews with people who have been patients of COVID-19. The raw data are audio recordings. They may be processed in the form of transcriptions, and what we see in the publications may be something like quotes that are showing the highlights and maybe the most remarkable findings of what is in these documents of transcriptions. When data are coming from interviews, that's the point of this slide, the situation of raw, processed, and analyzed data is very different from the way a lot of open science initiatives started with, because they started with archival data, surveys, experiments, and this is not the predominant way of collecting data in much of the social sciences. And that makes it hard to adopt principles of open science in the social sciences. Not impossible, but different. And we see that when we take a look at the way data are reported in publications in our Faculty of Social Sciences at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. We see that interviews in 2018 have actually become the major source of data in the faculty. So I'm showing here the distribution of data reported in publications in our faculty. And what we've done is we've taken a sample of 100 empirical publications from a very large universe of publications in our faculty. So about 30% of publications in the faculty reports on interviews, about equal but a little bit less on surveys. There is about 1/5 talking about archival data, 10% working with observations, mainly from ethnography, and then there is some news and social media and other audiovisual media data. The number of interviews in publications has increased a lot, not just in terms of the number of articles, but also in the proportion of total research output. Primary data are more likely to be from interviews these days than they used to be. And the availability of data in publications is partly reflecting the kind of data that we collect. So in 2018, in this sample of 100 publications, we see that only 8 make the data publicly available. That would be very much in line with the code of conduct, but that means that 92% is not yet fully in line with the best practice of open science. 10% says, well, data are available upon request. 15% provides a reference and citation to another data set. 17% does not do that, but just gives the name of the data set analyzed. About a quarter does not even give a name or a reference. And the most common way to refer to data, to talk about the availability to data, is saying there is another article that has already described this data set. Now, there is progress, even though 8% is a very low number to give publicly available data. The number of publications that give at least some details on the data analyzed has increased sharply. So in 2018, about 80% gives at least some details, and this was way less in 2013. So we are making progress. But when we do interviews with people who are working in the faculty, there are a number of hindrances and barriers that they mention towards making their research more reproducible. And we wanted to know what the barriers were, because this survey gives us an estimate of the majority not giving full access and transparency. But why is that? And these results are preliminary and they're illustrative. They're not representative, but their purpose is to give an overview of what is going on. So the baseline that we find among people who are sharing is that reproducible research is desirable, especially when the goal of research is to develop knowledge that can be generalized to other samples. So we find very positive practices among researchers who belong to the kind of researchers that have been opening up science in the past decade. But that's a minority. I mean, research can be reproducible when you have this kind of knowledge goal, but that's not the majority of researchers. In our faculty, and I guess this goes for many other social science faculties, there is a lot of idiographic research where the goal is not to create generalizable knowledge, but to show how things work in concrete, specific, unique contexts. And the attention to detail and attention to uniqueness is maybe more important than the attention to generalizability. Some researchers think that reproducible research is actually meaningless. So in some cases of ethnographic research, the only data that are presented are basically memories or interpretations of researchers, where there is no primary field data. And there are maybe field notes, but they are very hard to interpret for outsiders. And if there are no field notes, of course, reproducible research is entirely meaningless. Another obstacle is the way data can be shared without revealing the identities of participants. So in a lot of qualitative research, interviews, group interviews, ethnography, The data can be pseudonymized, but if you do that according to the rules that we have here in Europe on the GDPR, the granularity of the data is reduced. And a lot of researchers think that the data are then not interesting for others. In some cases, making research reproducible can actually be dangerous. When giving details about where the data were collected may expose the identity of research participants. And this happens a lot in ethnographic research, where interviews are done or observations are done in war zones or in civil conflict situations. And making details public on your participants can also be a threat to your credibility as a researcher. So when you've promised anonymity to informants, it would be a violation of their trust. If at some point in the future, their identity might be revealed. And the problem is not so much that maybe your making details would identify their persons, because researchers tend to be very careful in giving such details. But it's hard to foresee what future discoveries will be made that make people identifiable with new technology. And people are aware of that. There is another downside, which has an entirely different source, but has a similar threat to the credibility of social science. So when the research results are in fact not reproducible from the data, and this would become transparent when you talk about where the data are and you make them available, well, then it becomes clear that the research is not of high quality and might actually be entirely wrong. So in Dutch politics, there used to be a minister who argued against transparency in the legal process and the political enterprise, because he said, you don't want to know how the sausage factory works. It's an ugly business. Well, of course, you can ask here, well, if people have nothing to hide, why don't they talk about their research and make details transparent? Well, this might be a reason. So what could be solutions to these hindrances? I've summarized some of these solutions in the form of P-values. P-values have gotten a lot of bad press lately, but I think we can actually P-hack our way to good science. What we did previously was merely prescribe a code of conduct and assume people know the rules and follow them, and create perverse incentives for them. We rewarded publishing in high impact factor journals and assumed that peer review would keep the bad science out. But that's not how it works. So what we need to do is we need to prevent misuse of data and less integer research by training, and not just of juniors in graduate schools, but also of seniors. So some of these suggestions that I'm giving here in the form of these p-values, they came from our research participants in the interviews. People say we should perform evaluations of how transparent people are in their research. And of course, this is a problematic thing because anything that you incentivize with performance evaluations also has downsides. But in addition to, or maybe replacing the emphasis on publishing high impact papers, maybe it is better to reward, if we reward something, transparent research rather than just high impact journal research. An important suggestion by a lot of people is that we need time. We need examples. We need tools and support, the kinds of things that Lena just talked about as researchers, as resources for researchers to work with. And most importantly, to pay for the good data management time that is required. So data management costs a lot of time. And this is actually something that you need to budget for in your research proposal. Things that were not mentioned by our interviewees, but I think we should do as well, are 3 further P's. First, to practice what we preach. So to have senior researchers lead by example and give the example of open science. The reality right now is that a lot of open science initiatives are led by younger people, by early career researchers. And for them, making a career is exactly very difficult. And people perceive this problem of maybe having a disadvantage in their careers by not focusing on high impact publications, but by slow science. Well, of course, we need to reform, and we are doing that. We need to reform the way we are rewarding careers. And that's something that people actually mentioned as an important thing to do. And we can do this also by praising and giving out prizes for people who are doing an exemplary job in transparency and open science. The problem of the older researchers being in the way is maybe a generational problem. And if we select new talent to be good at open science practices, they will replace older faculty in the long run. There are things that are questionable p-values, I think, when we think about reforming science to become more open. Just being patient and persistent. Patience and persistence is important, but that alone will not change anything. That leaves the responsibility for good science up to individuals, and that's not enough. Preaching without practicing, I think, is also very problematic. Giving the good example is a better way. Payments for good behaviors, I think, also have downsides. So when we start to provide financial incentives for publications, I think there are so many downsides to that. That doesn't seem to be a good way. And then for things in the future, maybe distant things, are just to be honest about things that went wrong in the past. And maybe it's also good to talk a little bit about the role that audits and fines could have in the long run. Right now, there is very little policing of non-transparent research, even though the code is very explicit about it. And a further radical idea that I would not promote myself, but that has been discussed, is to work with permits and introduce a research license that actually can be revoked if people violate the code of conduct. That was my contribution today. Thanks.